Before we get started with today's video, I want to welcome you to a new series. We are going to start a DIY series. This is by no means to be considered professional advice, professional help. This is just to show you how we do some of the basic maintenance and projects on our camper. When we built the camper, we didn't decide to put any of those videos on YouTube. Actually, most of those are just on our Instagram channel. So it's all in pictures, and we know, just like when we were building our camper out, that we wanted the opportunity to learn from others. So we're going to try and go back and do that as best as we can with kind of this series. The video you're about to watch took place almost a year ago when we had a problem on one of our earlier trips of the year with our bearing. So I hope you enjoy the video and look forward to producing many more for you in the days to come.
We are looking for some things to do today, possibly, if it looks like the weather's going to be decent, but for the most part, the day is going to be here at the campsite. We have a few repairs we need to make, because on the way here we had a tire issue which caused a bearing issue, so we need to make some repairs before we hit the road again tomorrow. And then we also just need to clean up and do our normal routine of the day before we roll out somewhere.
So part 2 of the day is going to be changing out a wheel bearing on our left wheel. As Rachel said earlier today, the tire issue that we had a couple days ago didn't really damage a wheel bearing totally, but it was enough that I decided to go ahead and replace it early. Just a little bit of wiggle is probably okay, but you know, we're gonna go another 1,000 miles or so before we get home. So I thought it would be a good idea, and thank you Amazon and Rite Aid. They have an Amazon delivery drop-off point, so we could order the wheel bearings that we needed and get them shipped in a couple days. So I'm going to go ahead and do that this morning. There's a massive pile of rain on the way, so I'd rather do it when it's dry than trying to do it in the wet, dealing with grease and other things. It's also about 45 degrees, and so I really don't want to be changing a wheel bearing wet and be at 45 degrees. So we'll walk you along with that process. For safety reasons, because we are on a little bit of a hill, I am going to hook the camper back up to the car to make sure that it doesn't roll anywhere while we're working on it, because we are going to have one wheel off the ground. So we'll catch you once we've got the car hooked up, and we'll get the camper in the air. Hey, Jordan from the future here. Thanks for watching as we walk through how we change out a bearing on our 1965 Heckaman Phoenix. We thought that we were going to be able to use the audio from the videos. I walked you through this, but about halfway through, the kids in the campground decided they wanted to wake up and pretty much ruin the audio for the videos. So as you watch this, keep in mind that this is the procedure for our camper, and the procedure for yours may be slightly different, but if you have a trailer axle with brakes and tapered bearings, this basic procedure should get you pretty close to what you need to do, even if there's some slight modifications. Again, this axle is from 1965, so it may look a little different than what yours is. So here you can see that we are taking the wheels off of the camper. That's always step one after you get it blocked and up in the air. I, however, on this trip did not have a battery powered impact wrench, so I had to fight the lug nuts to get them off after they replaced the tires earlier in the trip. So I just decided that I wanted to lower the stabilizers for a little extra safety after the camper was in the air, and then proceed to take the wheel the rest of the way off. And we, as a personal preference, decided to use Timken for all of our bearings and the bearing grease, but of course there are other manufacturers out there. We also use Bearing Buddies. I know that they're not required, and some people have different ideas of using them versus not using them, but my family has used them for the last 30 or 40 years, so it's what we do and it's what we know that works well for us. Your situation may be a little different. So here you can see that we are pulling out the cotter key that helps hold the castle nut onto the spindle. And once we get the cotter key out, we can kind of test the tension on the bolt. What I'm really looking for here is just to see how much play was actually in the bearing when we had the wheels replaced due to the tire blowing out. They told us there was some play, but I wanted to check that just to make sure and to know what I was getting myself into. So on this trip I didn't have the greatest set of tools, but there are things that you prepare for to break, and then there are other things like changing bearings where you have the tools that you have and you make them work. So if I was doing this at home, I'd obviously have the right size wrench or something better than a monkey wrench, but it worked in this case. So as the castle nut comes the rest of the way off, this is where we're going to find a washer and the outer tapered bearing. So just to make sure it stayed on and didn't go rolling away because we were on the hill, I used the brake drum to pop the tapered bearing out and then make sure that I got the washer off of the outer tapered bearing. I only have one of those and I have yet to been able to find a second as a backup, so if I lose those I'm not going to have a good day. Bearings, at least in my experience, will have a little bit of wobble in them. It's just how they're designed, but you'll see once we get to the next inner bearing, which you can kind of see there sitting on the spindle, it has a lot more play than what the outer bearing did. So I always believe in a clean workspace as much as we can, so also protecting the environment. Grease isn't exactly kind to nature, so we put some towels down. And this is just me checking the bearing again. There is definitely quite a bit of play, I would say more so than what I would consider normal. And even if I had gotten to this point and decided, yeah, well, it's probably okay, I have brand new bearings, those are more than a few years old, so I would have gone ahead and replaced it anyway. The next step here is just a little additional cleaning to get out any of the accumulated gunk and brake dust. And I thought forward enough when we went into town to pick up the parts to do this project. I would have bought a bottle or two of brake parts cleaner and really hosed this out, but when you're sitting in the middle of the campground you don't always think that far ahead. So these brakes are from eTrailer. I did replace them a couple years ago. They were a 4-bolt bolt-on unit, and they're self-adjusting, which is really nice. So if you are needing a new set of brakes, go to eTrailer. They did as well. So at this point we now have to pack the bearings. Some people do this barehanded. Probably if I was at home I would do it barehanded. So the next process here is just unboxing and getting ready to pack the bearings. It's always good to check the bearings and just give them a spin once or twice to make sure that there were no defects in the manufacturing process that would make you have to redo this process again any earlier than what you'd have to do it. So as I said, there's an outer bearing and then this is the inner bearing. Again, I use Timken, but you can use whatever your heart's desire as far as a manufacturer. I decided to go ahead and do the bearing pack manually. You can buy a power packer, is what they call them, or a mechanical packer, but we don't pack bearings all that often, and so this is just the easier way to do it. This is the way that I was taught, and it's also the way that Timken recommends you pack bearings. So what you see is me taking a big goop of grease, putting it in my hand, and then kind of using that outer edge of the bearing to scoop grease into the bearing and then push it back into the rollers, the actual bearings themselves. And I don't know that there's a certain amount of grease you're supposed to put in. I've just always kind of gone until I get to the point where I can see grease all the way through the bearing, front to back, and then I kind of clean up the excess, because excess grease is just going to depart the bearing as it spins and end up making a mess inside. So this is what I use, is their grease that is coming out of the rollers. You can see it in the front, you can see a nice little layer in the back. And an important note here, behind that bearing is a bearing seal. I didn't think to replace it, and when I did this, and I probably should have if I was thinking ahead, but I was really just thinking about the bearing. That bearing seal is what keeps grease from getting through the hub and then into the brake assembly itself. When you do the outer bearing, it's the same process as the inner, it's just smaller. And I've only personally ever packed tapered roller bearings, but I would assume that if you have straight bearings or another type of greasable bearing, that the process is fairly similar in design. At this point, what we're really looking to do is just reverse what we did. So we'll pick up the brake drum, which my brake drum also has the studs for the wheel pushed into them. Some do, some don't. Some trailers nowadays have disc brakes as opposed to drum brakes like what these are. So your mileage may vary on the actual process for reassembly, but hopefully if you took it off, you put it back on the same way and it works. So after you get the assembly on, we put the inner bearing, or sorry, the outer taper bearing in, take care of some of the excess grease on the end of the spindle, and then we go find that washer that I mentioned earlier. The washer does have a keyway in it, so it only goes on one way, and it fits into a notch on my spindle. Not sure why it has. Maybe you can tell me why some of these have a notch in them, and I've seen other trailers that don't. Maybe this is just a design item from 1965 that they thought worked. At this point, I am just trying to seat the bearings, let them spin a little bit, and just do kind of a final double check before I put the castle nut back on. There are different specifications for how tight you are supposed to torque down the castle nut onto the hub itself. Some have an actual torque specification. I have found in some of my work on cars, the front wheel bearings will say torque to X number of foot-pounds. However, on a trailer like this that has axles as old as what they are, I prefer to use Timken's recommendation, which is basically to say tighten it until it's snug, so that way there is no side-to-side play. You can't rock the brake drum as it sits on the hub, and then back it out until you can line up a castle nut, usually about 1/8 of a turn, give or take a little bit. Another method that I have heard, which is kind of what I'm doing here, is get about 1 revolution of the hub and then it should stop. That's tight enough. But again, check your own trailer specifications as far as what their procedure is. Some have a specific one and others don't. So the last step is getting the cotter key put back in. The cotter key is used to make sure that whatever you have torqued the nut to, it doesn't back itself out as it's going down the road. Of course, losing a wheel would make you have a really bad day, so we try not to do that as much as we can. Yes, I know at this point I should have used a new cotter key. That is at least my normal practice, but I wasn't thinking that far ahead on this project, so we reused the other one, and then I actually just put new ones on when I got home. So this process is pretty straightforward. Drop the cotter key into the hole, push it all the way down, and then once you get it all the way in, split the cotter key in half so it doesn't back out. Now the way that I have been taught to put a cotter key back in is to take 1/2 of the cotter key and spin it up and over the top of the spindle, that is to say, to make it vertical, and then wrap the other half of it around the side of the castle nut. Again, different people have different ways of doing this. I have seen some that just split it to both sides, one on the left and one on the right, and I'm assuming that would work too, but this is the way that my family has done it for a lot of years. And somewhere in here I was wishing I brought better tools, because this is made a lot easier when you have the appropriate tools to get these pulled apart. But when you are 1,000 miles away from home, sometimes you decide that you're going to do whatever works best. And of course, the last step after you put a bearing buddy on is to grease it, and you grease it until there's enough grease inside of it that the edge of the bearing buddies will rock. And then you put the bearing buddy bra, as they call it, back on. I don't know that you necessarily need one, but I choose to use one. I carry with us a small Lucas mini grease gun. I know some people use a larger one, some people use a smaller one. But for our general travel needs, this little guy seems to work pretty well for us, and it doesn't take up as much space as a standard grease gun. The last item that we have to do on the project, of course, is to put the wheel back on, and somewhere in here is also where I am really wishing I had that battery-powered impact wrench. Since this video, I have bought one, and I've used it a couple times. It is absolutely wonderful. If you haven't bought one, I highly recommend that you do it and just make it a regular part of your toolkit. The final part for us is putting the hubcap back on, and we're done. Thank you for watching as we change the inner and outer wheel bearings on our 1965 Heckaman Phoenix. This is by no means a be-all end-all to how you change a wheel bearing, but this is the process that we use on our particular camper. I would assume that this process would be similar on your camper if you have a setup like ours, and if by chance you don't, I'd recommend going to whatever manuals you have access to and following the directions that they have there.